on Monday, August 10th, here over Zoom that we're still doing due to COVID-19 restrictions, although Town Council in the near future is looking forward to using distancing and getting back together. It's live streaming obviously through Zoom and also on Facebook. At this time, I'll look for, first of all, I'll do a recording of attendance. I note that all members of council are in attendance. And I'll look for a motion at this time to approve the agenda.
Also move.
Thank you, Councillor Bishop. Could I have a seconder for that?
I'll second it.
And Councillor Akaji. All right, any changes? I know that there was an addition added on. Is that a friendly amendment or should that be a formal one?
Prefer formal.
What addition?
The addition is in regards to a motion for the Wellness Center. I believe it would take unanimous council vote in order to add it in on the agenda at this point. So it's regarding the naming of the new Wellness Center. Would be the addition of the motion that would have been sent to you by email.
When was that? Or can wait?
It's going to mess up construction council. So since this is the only agenda, if you could add it, we can explain it to you a bit more than if you want to tell us to wait at that point. But right now we're just approving the agenda.
Okay, I move that we add it to the agenda.
Okay, could I have a seconder for to amend the agenda? I see Councillor Harrison. Okay, any other discussion on that being added to the agenda? Seeing none, I'll call those and question all those in favor of voting in favor of the amended agenda. Please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? So that was unanimously carried. So therefore we can make the change, but I think we'd have to go back now and accept the agenda. Is that correct? Now that it's been amended. So could I have a motion to approve the agenda at this point?
So move.
Councillor Akaji, a seconder.
I'll second it.
Councillor Bishop, any other changes, discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor of approving the agenda, please signify by saying aye.
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 And that's unanimous, so that has been carried. Disclosure of conflict of interest. Anyone at this particular time? See, let me know. And at this point, we are now getting into the introduction, consideration, and passing of bylaws and motions. Do you have a preference, Mr. Knopper, Mr. Spear, on which one we talk about first?
Maybe let Mr. Gopin go ahead since he's coming in special for this meeting.
That sounds good to me. So at this point, this is a council workshop on the draft zoning bylaw. We'll pass it over to Mr. Gopin, who will update council. In particular, I think there's a bit on Airbnbs and things, so look forward to having that conversation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor and Council. Before jumping into the zoning bylaw, I just want to put it on council's radar, and I'm not sure if it can be discussed tonight because it's not explicitly the zoning bylaw. But after the public hearing from the municipal plan, I'm not sure how council wants to proceed with the municipal plan at this point. There was still a bit of feedback from the public, and I think there are ways to make some changes that would not be substantial, so we wouldn't have to go to another public hearing. That would hopefully take care of things. So again, I don't know if you can discuss that now or if you want to wait till a later meeting, but I just wanted to put it on the radar at least.
We'll see how, I guess, what we have to talk about, how long that takes first, and then maybe adjust accordingly if that makes sense. Sometimes we're long-winded.
Sure.
Your worship, or Deputy Mayor, if I may, maybe Xander, it'd be better if you could fire off a staff report, just basically what you think, what you heard, then we could bring it forward to next week's meeting. Just
Sure.
because all we're looking for is direction and give everyone a chance to see what your recommendations are.
Sure, no problem.
I think that makes most sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we will talk about the zoning bylaw, and I've got a little presentation here about changes in relation to short-term rentals. Which I think there was a report for. And I guess we were supposed to have this discussion on July 29th, but having it now, so date hasn't been updated. But So basically, as we've been going through the zoning bylaw process, there's been some changes in the market. If you look at the chart of short-term rentals in St. Andrews, it's not nearly at what it was at the same time last year. You had 68 at this time last year, and there's only 39 now. So the market has certainly been affected by coronavirus, although it seems like the town is still very busy, which is great. But that's an overall 43% drop in short-term rentals. The occupancy rate for those at this time or around this time is 55%, so they're not all being occupied. And another thing to consider, unfortunately, is that it's likely that this fall and winter enrollment will be down at NBCC, and so that's historically been a pressure on the rental market, which might be a little bit less this year. You're also, because so many people are involved in tourism, although things seem very well down there, there might be some increased economic hardship for residents. They might be looking for alternative means of providing a little bit of income. And then the language in the municipal plan has changed a little bit too. So whereas before it talked about negatively impact, it now talks about significantly impact. And it does advocate, and one of the policies is to study the market for impact. So that's, even though that plan isn't in total effect yet, I've definitely been doing that behind the scenes. We've also been doing research on the long-term rental market. And this is part of an overall larger housing study, but it's very good to have this data because we know that the vacancy rate for long-term rentals right now in St. Andrews is around 2.3%. So it's a little low, but it's not disastrously low like some other municipalities around. So that's kind of the snapshot of where we are right now. And we've also gotten some public feedback on the matter, and it doesn't seem to be a lot of opposition to regulating short-term rentals, but there does seem to be some opposition to the idea of having to go through a rezoning as well as getting permits and paying fees. I think the rezoning process is seen as particularly onerous, and it is. It's a lengthy, expensive process. So I've been reconsidering these things, and I know that some counselors have been thinking about it as well. Does it still make sense to require rezoning to SRT, ERT zones as is currently proposed? When we talked to our legal advice about this, Andre Digg, he said, you can do rezonings this way. It's not something he's seen in other municipalities. It isn't something I've looked across the country to see how these things are regulated, and it's not something seen. But permits and fees is something that's becoming a very common way of regulating Airbnbs. There's been a few court cases around it in Toronto, and those have been settled. So it's seen as the best way to do it by experts. And just to remind, again, the rezoning process, it's a $1,000 fee. You get views of PRAC. There's a public hearing, 3 readings, development agreement for terms and conditions. And that puts a lot on council's plate. It puts a lot on staff's plate, as well as being an additional hurdle for people. As well, if we go to the rezoning route, there's the added complication of the current zoning bylaw and how murky it is on this issue. So there would be a lot of trying to figure out which properties were legally non-conforming, which weren't, which would, I think, drag the process of the zoning bylaw out unnecessarily. As I said, you do see this bylaw permit fees regime as a way to deal with this, but no specific zones, although you would still have zones, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It would still be in the zoning bylaw. So how would only having a bylaw under the Local Governments Act with permits and fees work? So we're moving out of the framework of the Community Planning Act, where the zoning bylaw gets its authority from, and we're doing this, we're talking about doing it through the Local Governments Act. So you would still have a general provision in the zoning bylaw, and this is very similar to the one on, I believe it's food trucks or food carts right now. The operation of a short-term rental shall only be permitted subject to a license or permit issued by the town. You could still allow short-term rentals as a main use in the tourist commercial zone, subject to general provisions, as bed and breakfasts are allowed now. And they could be allowed as secondary uses in the SRER and central commercial. So sorry, service residential, estate residential, and central commercial. Also subject to the general provision that in any scenario with the short-term rental, you do have to get a permit, and there can be fees involved in that. There's sort of recommended amounts. So in the short-term rental bylaw, if you were to adopt that, you could have fire safety requirements, requirements that an operator or agent be on site or can be available, with great ease. They can be inspected at any time by enforcement officers. You can have applicants provide a floor plan up front showing where beds are, showing where fire alarms, smoke alarms, exits, so that there's public safety involved in the allocation of these permits. You can ensure that there's adequate amounts of parking. You can have the requirement to notify neighbors. You can limit outside gatherings. You can require business registration. There's a whole suite of things. You could do more, you could do less, and I'm sure that's something that will probably be discussed tonight. Some other considerations for this bylaw, you would definitely want to issue the permits on a one-year basis, so that you can really assess at the end of that year how each operator is doing and require reapplication, and then you can obviously revoke the permit if conditions are not being met. Becomes a bylaw enforcement issue. And this will, I would assume this will have some impact on the short-term rental market. And it will allow for study, and it's hard to know exactly what next summer is going to be like right now, but there's time to kind of see what plays out. And if it is seen that these short-term rentals are significantly impacting the long-term market, the number of permits can be capped, and you could do a lottery system for fairness in terms of awarding them. If it was really an issue, you always could amend the zoning bylaw and introduce zones just for it. So when I kind of surveyed different municipalities' bylaws, it seemed like the $50 to $350 range was the usual fee for the permit, basically dealing with the administrative cost of issuing it and the potential for bylaw enforcement. So I think that's something to still be worked out, and can be a discussion if this is the direction that council chooses to go with. So it's a much easier process. You apply for a permit. That permit is reviewed by staff. The permit is either issued or not, depending on making sure it's in an appropriate zone. You still have to do that, making sure the conditions that need to be met up front are met. But it means that you still have to put some time and thought into your operation if this is something you want to do, and I think that will discourage people who want to do it as a fly-by-night easy thing without any consequences. And then also, some of the ways that I've been doing research on this, there is some software available that can help with enforcement and monitoring. There's an app called AirDNA that scrapes the web for Airbnb and VRBO listings. It gives you approximate locations, the occupancy rate, types of rental demand, and other stats. So it makes the study of these things very easy. That's it. That's my presentation. So there's a few other things in the zoning bylaw I wanted to talk about, but I think this is the biggest issue, and so I wanted to give it time up front and give it time for discussion. So I'm curious to hear what people have to say about it.
Thank you, Alexander. Appreciate it. So to break that down a little bit more, doesn't mean that you have to if you are looking at a short-term rental bylaw, it doesn't mean that you have to like everything that was presented tonight. Those are some suggestions and ideas. But the question really is do you think that it should be a short-term rental bylaw or it should be monitored through the zoning bylaw? Would that be the very simple, what you're looking for consensus from council tonight?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's open it up, with that being said, to some discussion from council. Councillor Groom.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I think, and perhaps I can get some advice from staff on this. It seems to me that there might be an opportunity here for council to streamline the whole process and maybe add to the accommodation levy bylaw so that there's only one bylaw dealing with short-term accommodation. So we have all the regulations and all of the conditions that must be met in that one bylaw, so that when we do accept issue permits and try to collect the accommodations levy, it's all being done under the same bylaw rather than having two separate bylaws and then tying it into the zoning bylaw. It sounds like it might be a complex thing if we try to have it separately. So I think there's an opportunity there to simplify things a little bit.
So basically, you're agreeing that it should be removed from kind of the zoning bylaw, and the only question is, can we merge it with the one that's already out there as far as for accommodation levy? So
Exactly, and I think that we have to put our heads around a little bit around how do we protect neighbors and property owners, and also the existing traditional Airbnb hotel motel community. We haven't heard too much from them because they're pretty busy right now operating their businesses. But I think that they might have something to say, and I think going through the accommodation levy will give us an opportunity to hear from that group as well.
okay, thank you, Councillor Grew. Anyone else? Silence is pretty good. So would I be correct in assuming that council supports the idea of this being a standalone bylaw removed from the zoning bylaw? Is there anyone that thinks it should be part of the zoning bylaw, I guess, to ask it the other way? All right, so what I'm gathering, Councilor Grew spoke to it. Alexander did make a proposal that we do it this way, and I'm not hearing any objection to that whatsoever, Alexander. So I would say that we would like to explore it, proceeding in that way, unless, again, any councillor would like to speak up.
I was curious, Deputy Mayor, how Xander was collecting his data on all the different websites and going through each of the listings to determine occupancy rates and stuff, and then he put up that what was it, AirDNA. So I would think through that we could certainly get feedback on not just occupancy rates, but also satisfaction rates. I mean, some people are hard to please no matter what, but I would think that any unsatisfactory Airbnbs, like we saw in the past that came to council from the community, could get flagged through that AirDNA. Would you be able to do that sort of thing, Xander?
I'm not sure. So I've been using, there's just like a free version. If you pay for it, it's very affordable. It's like $20 a month or something. And I think you can definitely track ratings. I'm not sure it ties it. I think, no, you would be able to see ratings for specific listings.
I think part of the issue in the past, when the Airbnbs all first started, was there were some unsatisfactory Airbnbs that came to people, wrote letters to council saying, what's the town going to do about this? Am I the only one that remembers that? That was, I think it was I think that's something using AirDNA that we could certainly flag.
No, you're spot on. There's been incidents where people are refused because they're on motorcycles and things like that. There's been some negative experiences in the community because there is no, I guess you could say, quality monitoring. But one could argue that the change of hotels, motels, that you could say the same thing though in the same sense.
Well, I'm not suggesting that we become the Airbnb police or or anything like that. Just that I think it would, if you even just looked at it once in a while, that problematic listings would kind of flag themselves over the short term.
Absolutely. At least you have a mechanism to deal with it if you do find a reoccurring, I guess you could say, offender experience. Councillor Grew.
Thank you. The one challenge with the using the rating system is that the ratings are only from the customers using the Airbnb. It's not a rating from the neighbors or from the people that might be affected by the Airbnb. So I think we have to be very cautious when we use that particular rating, that we're aware of the fact that it's only coming from the customers using the Airbnb, not the rest of the community.
Thank you, Councilor Grew. That wasn't my suggestion, simply that this would give us a mechanism. In the past, we had specific letters from people in the community complaining about unsatisfactory Airbnbs. I mean, those would have been flagged by Airbnb itself, but getting the town into the game of issuing fees, or not issuing permits. I prefer to say paying a fee versus a permit, but I mean, you can't control what people say, that's for sure, on Airbnb.
Sounds good. Well, we can sort all that out as the bylaw gets developed. I guess tonight was just general consensus if we like the direction of it going that way. And again, I think that we have that. Is there anything else to add to that one?
Just one point I'd like to sort of clarify is, if we're going to go the route of a separate bylaw to govern Airbnbs and short-term rentals, it almost seems that we'd have to do that in parallel with the zoning bylaw. So because it's referenced in the zoning bylaw, so we'd almost have to see what are we voting on and how does that work? So it adds, I guess, another level of complexity for Xander. I guess the reward for good work is more work.
The mayor isn't here to say it. Somebody's got to say it.
Oh, dear.
So do you think that that's something kind of come up with a draft bylaw for, based on kind of best practices from other communities?
Yeah. I'll do my best to do that. And
Can we have it tomorrow morning? I'm just kidding.
we're also moving our offices at the end of this week.
All right,
so.
then tomorrow at lunchtime.
Okay.
Yeah. I appreciate it. I know you guys are busy, so but overall, it sounds like the direction council wants to go.
I'll have to talk to staff about probably Chris about how to merge it with the accommodations levy bylaw, because that I would need some assistance on.
We might not want to do like a combo. They're going to have to interact together, but if the province ever changed their policy on levies, we wouldn't want to lose our policy on Airbnbs or whatever, VRBOs. So they have to play well, and maybe it'll only be one fee between the two things, but we might want different separate bylaws.
Deputy Mayor, if I may.
Absolutely.
Just to follow up with Councillor Harrison, I was thinking the same thing. I wish Councillor Grew's idea would work, but I'm afraid because of the enabling legislation with the LGA, I don't know if they'd mix really well. So it probably would be better to have two pieces and not just refer one to the other. The other question about whether we should run it in parallel to the zoning bylaw, well, it makes sense up front. The only thing I'm wondering is it'd be nice to be able to debate this after the season's closed a little bit, for other people. So I think, Paul, we're trying to wrap up everything, if we could, the zoning and stuff before budget time, so September or so. And then you might want to take a few weeks after that before, once the providers have gotten their head out of their businesses, and be able to provide good debate in October and early November, maybe to try to have that bylaw in place by the end of November instead of delaying the zoning bylaw. So that probably be my recommendation. I think Xander and staff should still work together and try to have something before you to consider in the next, couple of weeks, just so we can at least, because it's something so brand new, we all have to have a chance to look at it, or whatever, maybe even by the committee meeting in a couple of 3 weeks, just to introduce it, and then maybe in start having some discussions on it, what you think, and move forward with that. But I wouldn't try to tie it down to the same timing as the other 3 documents that we're trying to put a final note on over the next couple of 3 months.
I agree. And there's a lot of people in the community that have bought properties based on the fact that they could have Airbnbs, and they're going to be very much want to be in the know exactly what that new bylaw could look like. So we don't want to push it through or anything like that. We want to make sure that the time that we do it is the adequate time to go through the process properly. That's
My only
great.
concern there is that it is referenced in the zoning, it will be referenced in the zoning bylaw. So it'd be very difficult for us to pass the zoning bylaw, which is referencing a document that has not been created. So that's the challenge there is I can't vote on a zoning bylaw or pass a zoning bylaw when I don't know what the whole picture is.
Why does it need to be referenced?
If I may.
Yep.
So you're allowing short-term rentals with the general provision that they have this permit that comes from a bylaw, this, I guess, a short-term rental bylaw. So if it's a good point. If the zoning bylaw was introduced first, then it would be referring to nothing. So I don't think you could get a permit in the first place. And then, I mean, I think by that time we should have a good idea of what's in it, but
Could the zoning bylaw be silent?
Pardon?
Could we just allow the zoning bylaw to be silent on the issue and then just have the other bylaw to regulate it?
You could. I think it would make it might make enforcement a little bit more difficult, but I guess if you didn't get a permit or you're not living by the permit, you're in violation anyways. You could still, the short-term rentals could still be the secondary use in only certain zones. It wouldn't affect that. You just don't have that general provision.
Whichever way is easiest. Let's go with that course.
Yeah, and let's work away at that bylaw and see where we're at before we get to the third reading of the zoning bylaw. We could always revisit this whole conversation then, because it might be quicker than we think. It might be a lot longer than we think, but right now I think we're guessing, right, to know if we'll be ready or not. But it's safe to say that's one that we look forward to seeing.
Can I just, might just semantics, but the difference between a permit and a fee. It seems to me that if you call it a permit, people might have a little bit more, might see that in a little bit more of a negative light. Whereas if it's a fee, it's something you're purchasing the right to do something, which you would incorporate into your as a cost of doing business. I know a permit is still, it's pretty much the same thing, but I like the word fee better than permit. Maybe I'm out to lunch. Well, probably am, but I don't know how anybody else feels about that. When you call it a fee, it just seems like it's something that's easier to work with than a permit.
It is, but I think the fear would be that if you just put a fee that anyone can pay it no matter what, and they have it. A permit is exactly that. You have to have permission to get it, right? So you have to meet the criteria versus just pay the fee. Would that be safe to say? So that's why
That'd be my interpretation too, Deputy Mayor, would be that a fee implies you just go in and do it and you've got your license, while permit/licenses have to have some type of approval process. And it is a bit schematics, but I think it's just to show that it's being controlled and not just walk in and do it like a dog license. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Discussion on this bylaw.
Anything else on this particular issue, or is there anything else, Alexander, that you wanted to run council by at this moment regarding the draft zoning bylaw?
Yeah, a couple more things. One is height. I'm not going to present that again, but there was a discussion on should the height definition be changed to basically midlines of certain roofs, and I think there might have been a conclusion to that, but I was also asked to speak to some designers and architects, so I did go out and do that. I spoke to 3 people. The designer of 131 Water Street, because they had to get a height variance, and so some of the reasoning behind that was more modern style of buildings have higher ceilings. I also spoke to the gentleman who did the design guidelines, who obviously put a lot of thought into those and how those would interact with the town. And I spoke to John Haddon as well. I know the town, he's followed along with the process, and he's a bit more of a traditionalist, I think. So I wanted to get that perspective as well. And generally, they were in favor of changing the height definition. When I spoke to Krista Downey, 131 Water Street, she felt like the different heights of, or the different styles of roof lines did different things on the inside. So, you know, it's very different to have a flat roof than a peaked roof. With a peaked roof on that top floor, you've got less and less headroom as you get closer and closer to the wall. So it's also a way of thinking about it from the interior of the building. And again, it's generally the best practice now. I don't think it makes a huge difference either way. And with the new design guidelines, there is an allowance for increased height in the historic business district. So I don't think it's a make or break thing, but just I wanted to give that feedback from designers to council and see if there was any further discussion on it.
And just to remind me, I think the bylaw still gives reference to midpoint, if I'm not mistaken. Was it not council's decision though to use the peak or the top last time we got a consensus, just to be? So I think last time we got consensus, it was peak, but with your, to your point is you've got some independent outside feedback on kind of what we should do. So I guess what the question is for council is, do you want to continue using the top or the peak being the maximum height, or the midpoint? And the midpoint, as we saw in some diagrams that Alexander was nice enough to reference to us, depending on your type of roof, that can vary quite a bit. So really the question is, do you want midpoint or the peak like it was in our previous bylaw?
Oh, and one more thing, you could still have a maximum peak height. You could still have that. So, you know, if you're worried about A-frames and things like extreme examples, you could limit those.
Okay, let's get some feedback from council on that one then. Councilor Greer, I see your hand.
Yes, thank you. First off, I believe that this issue was decided by council. We reached a consensus that we wanted the height to be measured as the peak, so that we would be consistent with the current practices that have existed for quite some time in the town. Secondly, the visual impact is only from the front. If you're looking at the visual impact from the side of the building, i.e. as a neighbor or whatever, an A-frame, which is allowed to go twice as high, would have a huge impact on the neighbor and on sight lines, etc. I think it would be a huge mistake on the part of council to dramatically increase the heights around town. This is basically height creep, and it's something that we have to control as a council. We've already had people who have gone before the PAC to request variances and have been denied and have changed their designs accordingly. And this would be sort of a slap in the face. And to speak to the design issues, I have a house here that meets the current height restrictions, and I have 9-foot ceilings on both floors. So you can work with the design, within the design guidelines we have. You just have to design accordingly, and you can meet all of the criteria you want to meet. So I think we should go to the peak to maintain consistency and a uniform approach across town.
Thank you, Councilor Greer. Other councilors?
I agree with the peak situation as well.
Okay. It's 2 for the peak. Any other counselor?
What was staff recommending?
I mean, our initial
Just to be clear.
recommendation was to change the definition to midline. But I think what's a little bit more important is that in the design manual, there is an allowance for additional height in the historic business district, because that's given those buildings, if there are, and again, and you really don't have any more infill opportunities, but with 131 Water Street, it was also constrained by the buildings on both sides. So I think with that allowance, the idea of context, I would still recommend for the new definition, but it's not going to be a very, as strongly as I would recommend for the short-term rental change, if that puts it in perspective.
Okay. For the peak. Any would prefer to use the midpoint?
No.
All right, so I'm just hearing 2 in favor of the peak, and the rest seem, so last council decision was the peak, and unless anyone wants to switch to midpoint, I think it continues to be the peak.
I think in these discussions too, we have to remember 1 month after we pass this, we can always change it.
Yep.
So we can't be too scared about getting everything right perfectly. That, yeah, I think we can move on some of these issues.
Absolutely. And was there more that you want to review with council?
Just, yeah, one more thing. So a mapping change that I think is in the current draft is there are some mixed use properties, some central commercial properties that are purely residential at this point, generally on the further ends near where the mixed use starts. And I think 235 Water Street was an example of a rezoning for someone to do a minor addition. And that person had to rezone because they're in central commercial and it was only a residential use. So at that time, we did an inventory. We found there were, I think, maybe about 10 more of these properties on Water Street. And in staff's opinion, it makes sense to change them to mixed use at this time. But if we do that, we should at the very least alert and give the owners opportunity to give any feedback if for some reason they want to stay in central commercial. Although they could still do central commercial uses in the mixed use zone, they would have to get terms and conditions from the advisory committee because that would be a change of use.
Kind of tying back into what I just said, if this has never come up before now as a big issue, maybe this is a project we leave for after we pass this version. And we can go back and start revisiting little spot items that I don't know, again, if we need to keep bringing up new things this late in the day. Because this seems like kind of a new, we've been working on this for a few years now, and I don't really want to, I don't know if we need to go back and ask all these people what they think of this issue. This is something we could deal with next year or the year after if it becomes an issue.
Any other councilors' comments on that?
Well, the only challenge with that is that you'd have to go through 3 readings if you want to make any change.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be, we're at the point right now where we have to go through the 3 readings. And if we see something that we think needs to be changed, this is probably the best time to do it. And I think Mr.
I find it's a bit of a house of cards, though, we keep building.
Your worship, through you or your deputy worship, I think Councillor Grew's right. It'd be nice to be able to get some of this housekeeping items cleaned up front, because of the opposite opinion of Councillor Harrison, I'd rather address it now and rectify it before it does become an issue and then become a hot button topic. You'd rather research it, talk to the homeowners when there isn't anything on fire before them. And then if they need a rezoning down the road, then it can be considered to go back there. But I think if they're purely residential now, it'd be nice to get those cleaned up, because if we don't, we'll keep forgetting about it. And in 10 years, when we revisit this, we'll never remember why the heck we had gone that way.
Can we get the list then? Because I mean, one issue I think we could have, if they, if someone wants to change it, like would they revert to commercial? Like, so these are central commercial properties. We're now going to allow to be mixed use as opposed to central commercial. How, like, is that what I'm hearing? Is that correct?
Yeah, if I may, that would be correct. And they would still, so both mixed use and central commercial are commercial designations under the municipal plan, so with the generalized future land use map. So that doesn't have to change with mixed use. And they're on the edges of the mixed use area already. And I can definitely provide a list and a map. But it would sort of just extend some of the mixed use area into the central commercial area. And because they're mixed use, they could switch back if that was ever desired, but there would still be terms and conditions on that.
Would it take away our ability to force them to do first floor retail and stuff like that if they're on Water Street?
Well, if they're doing a commercial use, then I think they would still have to live by the central commercial portion of the zoning bylaw. And if they're doing a residential use, then it would be a main residential use. But none of the properties front onto Water Street.
Oh, okay.
They're all
And if
either
I
on the
may,
water side or on the further north side of the not water side.
Maybe a list would help because that may just answer the question. If it's the ones
Sure.
I think it is, then yeah.
So
and just food for thought, council too, is that if the adjoining neighbors are in the neighborhood and those properties have been residential use, they'd probably get an awful surprise if they find out that someone could buy them if they're still under a form of commercial and turn it into something that in the middle of their neighborhood. So if the surrounding properties have all evolved into one use right now, I think it'd be good to have them classified like that so the neighbors don't get a surprise down the road if there's a new use and it just happens to be mistakenly classified like that. So for instance, if it's still commercial or mixed use, hypothetically, you might have 3 or 4 houses that are all residential, then somebody wants to stick in whatever, convenience store where there's houses. Well, there'd be nothing really for council to stop them if it's already zoned properly, right? So, I mean, that might be a bit of a simple example, but you get the idea. And as Zandra says, I don't know all the properties, know a couple of them, but they don't all go on the front of Water Street. But still, I think if they're clustered together as residential anyway, it'd be good to reclassify them. And then in the future, if they want to go that way, then the neighbors on both sides aren't going to be surprised by this oversight.
Go
Go ahead, Councilor Grew.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I understand too, if we don't do something like this, if any of those homeowners decide they want to do an extension or renovation or something, we would have to rezone them on a case-by-case basis, as we did with the home on Water Street beside the Fundy Bay Real Estate. So this is almost a preventative measure. We have a cluster of houses that are primarily residential, that if we change them to mixed use at this point, it saves us a problem down the road. Am I correct in that assumption, Mr. Gopin?
Yeah, that's basically what I'm saying. I mean, you could wait until the first one needs to do a rezoning and then do them all, but for that person, then they're and probably return the fee in that case. But that person then they still have to go through that 6-month waiting period. And I do have the map. I can show. I can share my screen and show that map. I'll send it around as well.
We might as well, since we're on it right now.
Yeah.
And then we'll get some consensus and move on.
The one in yellow, I don't think would change. I think that is a residential use with a home business, not sorry, it is
No.
it is business, yeah.
The yellow one, I think, is a house, isn't it? It used to be the Northern Art Place, but I don't think it is any, like now it's purely a house.
Yeah, you're right.
What about if you're down at the base of William Street? It should be both sides of the street are currently residential. Like the old dive shop is now just residential, I believe.
I'm not it might be. I don't, although it's kind of a weird, is there an actual house there?
Yep.
Okay.
But I mean, I don't know that they may rent out things and that, but you also have a lot of empty lots with Red Line, right?
Yeah, and those might, the ones, I think these are behind like Harborfront, might make sense to keep those commercial.
I'd keep as much commercial as you can in that core.
Okay, so anything that isn't, well, what I'm hearing from Councilor Harrison is anything that isn't actually a residence should stay as central commercial.
I think that would be unanimous consent on that one for sure.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Where are the 10 residences in the historic business district? I don't see them all.
So there's one, the ones outlined in red are the
Oh,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And I did get a call a couple of weeks ago from someone who was in this situation, and they weren't looking to do anything, but they thought it was strange. And I mentioned that this might be happening, and they did say like, "Oh, that sounds good. Like, I might want to do something later, and then this would allow me to do it."
Okay, so council, what I'm thinking is although we're kind of seeing them, we'd like to see the list. And I know that all of us, if we are going to do this, definitely want all these homeowners notified. Whenever you change the zoning of someone's property, they need to be part of the process and be aware of it to voice any concerns they have. Is there anyone, though, that, again, I know Councillor Harrison was originally stating to leave it out, but I think, would it be safe to say that majority of council thinks that as we do this map, it'd be the correct time to address this issue?
I believe so.
I think so. What I would suggest that we might just confine it to the houses on Douglas Street. And that takes care of the majority of them. I don't want to fragment our commercial zone too much.
Could I ask a question related to our earlier conversation? And I think I know the answer, but central commercial, that does not make it any easier for them to rent to tourists, or does it? Because I think some of these are, they use them as rentals sometimes, on Douglas especially.
Let me pull up. I think.
Or would this new bylaw take care of all of the short-term rentals?
Well, it would still have to be an allowed use in the zone. So in mixed use, it would be allowed. And I actually am not sure if it would be an allowed use in central commercial.
I know there used to be tourist homes and various wording that sounded like you could do it, but.
Yeah, I just want to pull up the bylaw and remind myself of what it says. So it's as the bylaw currently is in the tourist commercial zone, you can do a tourist home or a short-term rental. And sorry, not as it currently is, as the draft is. You can do a tourist home or short-term in tourist commercial. but not central commercial. And mixed use, I believe you can do tourist commercial in mixed use, but I want to check on that.
I mean, we will hear back from the people if for whatever reason the change is going to not be to their liking. So I guess we can move ahead with it for now.
I think moving ahead with it for now is probably the best course.
Okay.
I think majority of council would like to consider it, but of course hear from the individuals that are most impacted.
Yeah. So I did find it. So in mixed use, you can do tourist commercial, subject to various other things, but it doesn't have to go to terms and conditions. So it's, if they were doing a short-term rental now, they would have to do it subject to, I think things that might make sense to take out if you're doing the bylaw. I just wanted to check and make sure it didn't also require terms and conditions, but it doesn't. So I think it wouldn't affect anybody who was doing something like that now, except they'd have to get a permit.
Okay, Councilor Group?
Thank you. Just very quickly, I think that as we explore the zoning bylaw and the short-term rentals, there's an opportunity for us to clean up the language so that it's consistent right across the board, no matter what zone you're in. And you just require a permit and you're good to go. And that might be an easy way to deal with this issue rather than having different conditions in different zones. And it sort of boggles the mind sometimes.
Yeah, and I think as the bylaw currently is, it still has the SRT and ERT, so it's kind of trying to deal with that a little bit too, but it can change, and it should change.
To your point, when you read the short-term rental bylaw, you want to know the whole picture and not be like, I thought I was approved, but then the zoning bylaw overruled it. You don't want to get into that. You need it.
Yeah.
When you read that bylaw, you need to know, are you allowed or are you not allowed? Are you up to the qualifications or the standards? Like it needs to stand alone where people know if they're approved or not, or essentially meeting the requirements.
Mhm.
That's a very valid point. Okay, anything else on that one?
No, that's it. So just changing anything that isn't residential to mixed use. And that's it. Those are all the questions and clarity I needed, so I can get a new draft of the zoning bylaw out to you next week. And I think the council meeting is the week after, something like that.
Sounds good. I know that there's been a pile of questions that have been coming in on Facebook. So I know you're going to probably sign off, but is it possible, Mr. Knopper, for you to maybe talk with Alexander tomorrow and get back to all those questions at the end that we don't answer them later in the meeting? Okay, perfect. Okay, so that wraps up the work session. The draft zoning bylaw, Councilor Group.
Mr. Deputy Mayor?
Yep.
I have a number of points that haven't been raised yet that I'd like to raise with Mr. Gopin and with the rest of council.
Okay, go ahead.
And I'll warn Councilor Gummershell, this might take a little bit of time. First, I guess I've been asking, and it seems to be falling off the radar screen, is we've discussed it before about adding a clause in the title and scope on the intent of the bylaw. And I've raised it before, basically saying that the intent of the zoning bylaw is to provide a consistent basis for development in the town of St. Andrews. And residents are expected to follow the zoning bylaw, and variances would only be granted where it can be shown that it's not possible to conform with the zoning bylaw. And that's important because when you go to variances, the language is very clear in the Municipalities Act that the intent of the bylaw is what they look at. And that's equally what the Assessment and Appeal Board looks at is what is the intent. So I think we need to have a clause there that says this is what the intent is. And I thought we had some sort of consensus there, or at one point it was agreed that this would be useful. So I'm just reiterating that. the definition, second point is we've taken tourist home out of the definitions, but throughout the bylaw, we still use the term tourist home. I noticed that in commercial, central commercial, we use the term tourist home in one of the allowable uses. I think it's throughout in the definition of boarding house, we use the term tourist home. So it just has to be cleaned up a little bit there.
Could I just if you could pause for a sec, especially with that first comment? I think if we want Alexander to do anything or Xander to do anything with these comments other than listen, then we need some sort of will of council.
I agree.
All right, so for the first one, for the statement about the intent, is everybody okay with that being included?
I mean, I'm not sure of that one because I don't want to make our zoning bylaw stricter than everyone else's. I think there's reasons that we have variances and that the case law around the variances has grown up how it has. We may not always be happy that we have to either appeal it to a higher level or kind of go to court, but I don't want to make St. Andrews the one place where we have to basically change our whole zoning bylaw because we find out after what mistakes we made and there's no variance mechanism because we've made it so strict to get a variance. And I just see a lot of unintended consequences from doing that sort of thing.
Okay, so I hear 1 for, 1 against. Other councilors, please. Oh, go ahead, Alexander.
Yeah, so I know that I think at one point I said that this was maybe something we could do. And after further thought and further discussion, and I think I included this in a report, not the most recent one, but one before that, I looked at just about every other zoning bylaw in New Brunswick, and all of them take the language directly from the Community Planning Act, which does state that the intent of the bylaw should be met in the case of variances. But it doesn't say that, I think the language Councillor Grew is talking about is you have to try and meet the strictures of the bylaw before you can consider getting a variance. And the issue with that is nobody has to develop anything. So by not developing, you can meet the strictures of the bylaw. And we do have people who come into our office and they say we want to do this, and we're like, oh, you can't do that. You would have to get a variance. They say, oh, well, can I get a variance? And then we say, well, let's talk about it. What are you trying to do? Can you maybe do it this way? And we definitely do push people in the direction of variance is a last resort, but it shouldn't really, it can't be stricter than the Community Planning Act. And I think the language from the Community Planning Act, which does deal with intent of the bylaw, which is you have to be able to demonstrate that you're still meeting the intent, if not the actual specific regulation. I really think that is what you want. And also by saying that variances may only be granted in this case, you're almost forefronting the idea of variances. So I really would recommend just have the language from the Community Planning Act. And it would take a lot of workshopping to formulate something that isn't stricter than the Community Planning Act without just having that language.
Thank you. So recommendation would be to leave it out from the planners. So again, 1 councillor for putting it in, 1 for leaving it out. Can I have some other councillors' input so we can get some consensus and move to the next one?
I will go with what Xander just suggested. Thank you.
Leave it out. Okay, there's three leave it out there. So I see Councillor actually raising her hand as well. So that'll be left out. Sorry, Councillor Grew. The next one was for consensus.
The tourist home issue, and that's just housekeeping issues.
I think we're good with that one. I saw Mr. Gopin just nodding his head that he could clean that up. So yeah, we continue.
The next issue I have is on the definition of building bylaw. It's just a matter of ensuring that the title of the bylaw is correct. I'm not sure if we call it the building and development bylaw or just the building bylaw, so it's just a housekeeping issue there as well. Excuse me. The next item is, I think, an important one, is that converted dwellings, rental unit, garden suites, whatever you call them, we need to explicitly state that the rental is on a long-term basis. And the reason for that concern is at the appeal board, one of the members there noted that the length of tenancy was not explicitly stated in our bylaw, and that it could be a short-term tenancy because we don't say it can't be. So I think we need to somehow explicitly state in the bylaw to reinforce it that it is long-term tenancy. And I think now that we're going to have a separate bylaw for short-term rentals, that makes it pretty easy because this becomes the de facto standard. But we need to explicitly state it somehow.
Mr. Gopin, to that one?
Sure. So I think I see the point Councilor Greer is making, but I think you do have a definition of short-term rental, which defines it as no more than 30 days. And if you were to do this, then you're allowing what I think we're going with is we're allowing short-term rentals in residential zones. These are types of dwellings in residential zones. Why couldn't you have a short-term rental in a garden suite, or in an accessory dwelling unit, or in a converted dwelling? Because they're describing the physical structure of the dwelling, but at the end of the day, it's a dwelling like a single-family home. Now, maybe you want to limit short-term rentals only to homes, but I think if you're controlling it with the bylaw, you don't need to go that far.
No, I think it can be done potentially with just one statement at the beginning that applies to all zones, saying that all rentals are long-term rentals unless they have a permit for short-term rental. Something along those lines, and then that blanket statement covers you off, and is consistent with the new bylaw we're proposing, and then it just strengthens the entire bylaw, and reinforces the fact that when we talk about all these things, they are long-term rentals unless they're permitted to be short-term.
Right. So that's actually that clause that we were talking about before with you need a permit to, you can do a short-term rental subject to this clause, which is you need a permit to do it.
But you
That's that
reinforce it by
clause,
saying
basically.
everything is long-term rental unless otherwise permitted.
Right.
Mr. Go- Yeah.
Yeah.
So just before I move on to that one, is that what you would like to see happen, Mr. Gopin? Because otherwise, I think we'd get some councilor consent on that one as well.
Well, I do think you want to, it's reinforcing it. It is reinforcing that unless you get the permit, anything is a long-term rental. Still, you would define short-term rental in the short-term rental bylaw. And if you were doing anything, if you didn't get a permit and you were doing a short-term rental, you would be in contravention of that and subject to enforcement. So
Exactly.
this statement reinforces it. I think there's grounds for enforcement either way.
Okay. So the rest of council, are you fine with that being included? It's not hurting it. It's just adding an extra emphasis to the fact that you need a permit for short-term rental.
Disagree.
Fine.
Well, I'm okay with that.
Okay, so I saw 3 that said it's okay to include that one. So we've got consensus on that one.
The next issue I have is it's a tough one, is fencing. There seems to be a discrepancy in the way we define fencing, especially with the front yard. In the town plat and historical business district, there's a limitation of 3 feet for the front yard fence. Outside of that, everywhere else, it's 6.6 feet. So you could conceivably have a house on Patrick, Prince of Wales, Chandler, with a 6.6 foot fence in the front yard. And I don't think that's what we intended as a council. I think it's just been an oversight in the language of the fencing. And also the problem comes in is that the fencing issue, you have the regular fencing in one section and you have deer fencing in another section. And it might be useful to bring that all together in one area so that it's if you have a fencing issue, you just go to one section and find out what you can do for a fence.
I think for that one, we were going to get some recommendations on deer fencing already. That was from the previous meeting, if I recall, the regular meeting. Yeah, I don't think we're going to sort that one out here tonight, to be completely honest with you. I don't know if it's as much as oversight as you think. I think that the downtown was specifically shorter for a reason, because the optics when you drive downtown, they didn't want the taller fences down there. I think it was, whether we like it or not, I think it was done intentionally for that reason. That the downtown is held to a higher standard because of the importance of the street, the visibility. Canada's a great street.
Yeah, but we've got a situation right now where people right across the street from each other have different standards for fencing. And I don't know if that's what we intended. I don't know if we want to redress that, but that's the situation right now, and it might be something that might be worth looking at to have some sort of a uniform standard across town. I don't know if we want to go there, but it's something that we're going to have to address sooner or later as we move through this zoning bylaw.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Spear, but I think we agreed that we were going to review that entire bylaw for this fall, winter, because there's a lot to that one. And we last meeting recognized that although deer are not necessarily, animal control is not the authority of the town of St. Andrews, it's the province of New Brunswick. As a municipality, we do take into account that homeowners have a right to protect their land. And right now, there's no magic light switch to fix the deer problem. So we need to be more open-minded on fencing, I think was the last conversation that we had. But I think it was something that I was almost under the impression we were not going to figure all that out as part of the zoning bylaw. Would that be safe to say, Mr. Spear?
That would be, Worship, that we talked last meeting or 2 meetings ago about that, and that we said, we brought it to your attention that there's specifically in deer fencing, that because deer fencing is supposed to be temporary and it's becoming in places permanent, which is showing up as unpermitted structures. And so we wanted more clarity what council felt deer fence was. But Councillor Grew's second point on 6 foot fences versus 3 foot fences is within the zoning bylaw. But as Councillor Harrison had said earlier, that we don't have to solve everything tonight because it's especially going into first reading. But B2, we can still do some more discussion on that as we go through the first 2 or 3 readings. That we'll take Councillor Grew's concerns and have a look at it and can sort of list that as still outstanding question from council and try to get more direction on how you want to go.
Yeah,
So
I don't think
it's
we're going to get a
mandatory
resolution
that-
tonight.
Yeah.
It's just flagging it for future consideration.
I think a majority of council, though, feels the same way you, that we do need to revisit that and really find a better policy for both deer and fairness in the town of St. Andrews.
Yeah. Next
Yeah.
thing I have is in the definition of land for public use, there's para H is still an error. And simple correction there.
Okay, that sounds like a friendly amendment if it is there,
Yeah.
so continue.
Next one is, again, a lot of housekeeping here. In the definition of livestock, it includes chickens. So you may want to delete chickens, even though I'm opposed to the chicken, the chicken bylaw portion of the bylaw. there's a discrepancy there where livestock includes chickens, so you might want to delete chickens from the definition of livestock. Okay, what else? In para 4.1.10 and 4.1.11, it might be useful to change the term "in a room used for sleeping" to "any rental suite," because it says you can't have cooking in a room used for sleeping, but maybe some of the places for rent have more than one room. So if you use the term rental suite, it's more inclusive, and it eliminates cooking in the whole rental suite. And that's just for consideration.
Mr. Gopin on that one?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, this is specific to bed and breakfasts in a single family dwelling. I mean, you could have a situation where there is a kitchen as part of the rental suite, and then that's more short-term rental than I think traditional bed and breakfast. You wouldn't find that.
Yeah. Anyway, if you could just have a look at that language and see what you can do with that, that would be appreciated. Item 4.2.2, and I know that Councillor Harrison raised this issue as a concern, and I still have a concern, is when you look at converted dwellings, we need to find some sort of a mechanism to control the spread of ugly staircases across town. Because as you do these converted dwellings, there is a possibility of having all sorts of staircases popping up. So, you know, hopefully we can find a solution to that, or find some way to address that.
I think that was an issue with the triplexes, and the definition was changed to say all entrances are, except for the main, are interior.
It was an issue with the triplexes, but I think it's also an issue with converted dwellings. It's how do you address that with converted dwellings? Because if you're allowing 3 converted dwellings per building, you could potentially have 3 staircases going up to the 2nd floor.
Yeah.
Which could look pretty, well, not very pretty. So I'll leave that with you. The other one is, and I think this is going to be addressed as you change the bylaw for the short-term rentals, but in para 4.4.1, subpara B3, where you address, you're referencing short-term rentals, the reference is the reference for bed and breakfasts. And I think that's going to disappear though as we.
Yeah, the whole zone's going to disappear.
Yeah. And I think that's about as far as I got, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I just gave up after that.
Thank you, Councilor Grew. Okay, so with that, is there any other councilor that would like to bring anything forward on this particular workshop on the draft zoning bylaw? Hearing none, thank you very much, Mr. Gopin, for your time, taking us through that. We really appreciate it. There is questions that I know are related to specifically your presentation. So again, we do have another motion that we need to discuss, but that is there. But if you do have to go, we do understand. And I know Mr.
No, I'm happy to stay on and answer them in person.
I'm assuming the next one will be fairly quick.
Yeah, no problem.
So at this point, we'll move. I don't know if you have it in front of you, Councillor Bishop. It's under your portfolio. If not,
No, I don't. I just, Mr. Knopper mentioned that we were trying to come up with a name for the wellness center. Is that what they're talking about?
correct. Does any other councillor have it in front of them?
I can get it.
Through you, Deputy Mayor, I'll share my screen and then everybody can see it.
Thank you.
That'd be great.
Just give me 1 second.
It's sure starting to take shape though.
Okay.
Screen two.
We lost it.
Yep, it's taking a second to load. My
Okay.
apologies, council. It's technology.
All right. I don't know, Councillor Bishop, if you can see that on the
Okay.
screen.
Yes, I can see it. Yeah.
Perfect.
FA 200801, August 10th, 2020, Wellness Center name. With the construction nearing completion for the Wellness Center at the W.C. O'Neill Arena, a name for the center needs to be determined. In order to proceed with finishing the front facade, the new sign needs to be put in place first. The following are some suggested names for brainstorming for the Wellness Center may include, and there's 6 of them. The Wellness Center, St. Andrew's Wellness Center, Health and Wellness Center, St. Andrew's Health and Wellness, Wellness St. Andrews, Team Health St. Andrews. I'd go with number 2 myself, but anyway.
So yeah, so there is a motion with blank. So it sounds like this is just a brainstorming process anyway. It doesn't mean we have to go with any. Of course, council does have the authority to move. The only thing that I'll add is, not to enter debate, is we do have a major partner in this project. And I think that when you have major funders, it would be good to let them be part of the process as well and make sure they're aligned to what it's called, because again, it's no small donation that the Dunn Foundation is giving us to make this possible. So just keep that in mind, council, as we make this decision.
So if we want them to chime in on the name for it, we should approach them and see what they would think about that then, eh?
I would recommend that we, shortlist it or tell them the one we like and see if they're okay with it, or vice versa. Let them propose whatever council desires. I just think that it should be some two-way communication when it comes to, your major financer to get some input from them on a project that they've invested so heavily in.
Great idea.
Was there a time constraint?
Well, it's coming to its completion.
Yeah, council, and just to go back, this isn't a simple, if you don't mind, your worship.
Don't mind at all. Go ahead.
What's the problem is this isn't a typical sign. It's going to be like those standalone letters are being placed up there, and there's a 2 to 3 month delay in getting those produced. So the worst case scenario is everything's ready to go and there's not a sign ready for it. If we kind of lag in this a little bit of time, but it's just really to try to move forward. So I don't know if it has to be decided tonight, but it's good to decide in the next couple of weeks so we could have the sign completed by the time the center opens.
Then we should go quickly to our sponsor and ask them to make a decision on what name they suggest, or we should give them a couple of names.
Agreed, Councilor. Actually, Councilor Grew.
Thank you. I think that in all of our correspondence with the sponsor, we've used the term St. Andrew's Wellness Center. We've used the word, it's well known. And I think maybe we should just go to them and say, okay, we're looking at calling this the St. Andrew's Wellness Center, if council agrees with that. Going to the sponsor, seeing if they have any objections so that we can move ahead expeditiously rather than go to them and say, hey, we'd like this or this and this, and have to come back to this again at another meeting. I think we can make a decision tonight and then just verify as a courtesy with our major sponsor to see if they're in concurrence with our name.
Sounds good. Any other councilors?
So if around the table we could come to the conclusion that we agree that number 2 might be our choice, then we could expedite this and go to our sponsor and say, here's the name that the people around the table or the town kind of likes, and do you concur with this?
Yeah, I agree. An option would be to, just for council to get consensus on the one they like, table the motion, and next Monday just vote it through after our partners have had an opportunity to say that they like it as well. Just for formality. You wouldn't want to formally appoint it with that name and then switch it, I don't think.
Well, I would go the other way. I'd say we formally appoint the name go to the partners, see if, as a courtesy, see if they like it. If they don't, then come back next Monday and say they don't like it or whatever, and we're having to change it. This
Okay.
way here, our staff can go ahead and if they get concurrence from the Dunn Foundation, they can go ahead and order it right away. And
Sounds good.
lose time.
We would,
Okay, do you want me to make a motion then? And
yes.
then it can either be voted down or not.
Okay, sounds good.
I'd like to make a motion that we approve the name, the St. Andrews Wellness Center for the new wellness center at the W.C. O'Neill Arena.
Can I have a seconder for that motion?
I'll second it.
Councillor Akaji, more conversation? Okay, I'll call the question. All those in favor of that motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, that is carried. So the direction for staff would be to take that to the Dunn Foundation, make sure that they're okay with it. If they're okay with it, then that's the name. If there's any surprises, council would very much appreciate their input and would love to discuss it again if need be. All right, so that wraps up motions. Now, I do know in the, before we get to question period, I do know that there is some inserts in our package. That was just information for council, correct? There's some drawings and things like that. We're not intending to talk about that tonight because we didn't advertise. Okay. And again, I know we're going to question period, but was there any need for closed session this evening?
You're muted, Chris. Can't
No,
hear
I'm
you.
not. I just shook my head, but no,
Oh,
Deputy Mayor, we don't, I have nothing before me tonight. I don't think, Paul, did I forget anything?
No,
No.
you haven't.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And at this point, I'll pass it over to Mr. Knopper just for questions. And thank you again, Mr. Gopin, for staying on just in case there's any that are relevant to you during this period.
Mr. Gilpin, there are multiple questions relevant to you for this period, so I'll just feed you one after another and you can answer how you want. The first one is, can current STR registered with the current levy program be grandfathered in? Investments have already been made in properties, etc. So I think that's more of a discussion topic for when we get to the bylaws, but if you want to touch on that.
I think they would have to be in the appropriate zone, but they would be allowed in the SR zone. At least my recommendation would be SR zone, ER zone, secondary use in central commercial. So you'd still have to have a main commercial use in the central commercial, although you can do a hotel or motel. In terms of grandfathering in, I think you'd still have to live with the conditions of the bylaw, and probably what is being referred to as grandfathering in is the fee, and that I don't think it really matters one way or the other. I think that's up to council if they want to. People have already paid a tourism accommodation levy if they wouldn't have to pay the short-term rental fee. But yeah, the only zones it wouldn't be allowed in would be institutional. Central commercial, again, it would have to be secondary, but you can do hotels or motels as a main use. So if there is no residential portion, then I think essentially you're doing a hotel or motel.
Okay. Second question is, what does enforcement look like for those that rent a short-term rental but do not pay fees or meet the permit requirements?
Well, that would have to be worked out in the bylaw. I mean, the enforcements I'm familiar with are under the Community Planning Act, but generally, you get a warning and says, you have to go get this permit, and then if you don't, then there might end up being a cease and desist or something like that. Again, it would have to be worked out in the bylaw, the specifics of it.
The next one is, I think we need to remove the ask the neighbor in the permitting process. If it is permitted in a certain area, then it is permitted. And as long as there is no noise complaints, etc., after the initial permit is issued, then the STR should be allowed to proceed. I think that's more of just a comment. Next one was, once the permit recommendations and requirements are established, I think a letter should be sent to all current levy registers. I would agree within that concept. There was a thank you to Alexander for his study work and recommendations on the STR. Another question, can we make sure that side yard requirements in the old bylaw for the tourism rezoning does not get added to the new permitting process? Perhaps that should only apply to new builds. So I don't know if that, you want to jump on that, Alex?
I'm not. I think that was something that had been discussed previously, but wasn't taken up in the bylaw. I think that was only for institutional zones, I believe, possibly tourist commercial. But it wouldn't apply to the SR, ER, or central commercial zones if that's what was being done. But I just want to take a look, and I think that's only in the mixed use zone with certain uses. And I think there was a question, should that be applied to other areas? And I recommended against that, and I think that was consensus of council was not to apply that. That's tourist commercial. So that's specifically for tourist commercial developments, abutting residential zones. That's the only time when that requirement exists. And that's something that's in the current bylaw, the current Z1804.
So the next one is more of a comment. The ask was, do not change the vacant lots to be mixed use. And secondly, they're too small to be built on anyways. So that was a question that came up. The next one was, do the definitions of downtown zoning mean that commercial areas cannot have any sort of short-term rental?
No, it doesn't mean that. They're in central commercial, they would be allowed as a secondary use. So if you have a commercial thing, and I think if you're on Water Street, I can't remember exactly how it works, but if you're on Water Street, you have to have that first floor commercial, although we've given variances for just fronting onto Water Street. I think that's the intent, and that might have even changed in this version. But no, they'd be allowed in their commercial area as long as you do have a main commercial use.
And so the final one that I have on here was more of just a comment just regarding guidelines that hopefully they'll become more clear within the process versus being muddied along the process. So I think we're heading that way. And at this moment, Deputy Mayor Henderson, that are all the comments that I have from Facebook and Zoom.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thanks again, Mr. Gopin, for staying on to answer those. It's really appreciated because it hasn't been that long tonight, but long enough. So thank you. Next would be councilors' comments. Any general comments from council?
I'd like to make a comment, please.
Absolutely, Councilor Bishop.
It's regarding the fencing and the height of fencing and things like that. Citizens are spending hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on plants and to have the deer eat them. I think they're just trying to protect their investment and try to have some beautiful flowers. And until we get rid of the deer problem, I can't blame them for, maybe they are going against our bylaws and things like that. And yes, they are. But I think they're just trying to protect their property and their plants. And I mean, we're overrun by deer. We're totally having a huge problem with them. They practically move onto my deck. If they could move onto my deck, they would. And so I'm totally fed up with deer. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you speak for definitely majority, if not all of council on that one. Just while we're on that, Wednesday, Minister Holland is meeting with the town of St. Andrews to discuss the ongoing nuisance deer issue in the town of St. Andrews. So hopefully we continue to make progress on that file, as I know council is extremely frustrated and a lot of residents of the town of St. Andrews are frustrated. So valid point. Any other councilors?
On Wednesday, Deputy Mayor, when Minister Holland's on, I know she's busy, but I wonder if the Chief Public Health Officer could get in on that call, because it's not just a nuisance deer problem. It's a health problem.
Absolutely.
I don't believe, in fairness to them, that they were asked to attend that meeting. Would that be safe to say, Mr. Knopper or Mr. Spear?
Through you, Deputy Mayor, that is correct. We only requested Minister Holland's time, and Minister Holland is providing it for us.
Correct. I can say that the Department of Health has reached out in regards to the food bank program around deer meat, and the summary of the response is that due to the pandemic, they're unfortunately too flat out to take that on this year. We'll leave it at that. It is worthwhile to maybe note going forward, we're having a meeting with them to invite them along, as to your point, it's a health concern in addition to an animal concern. And to be honest, I would argue that it's more of a health concern than an animal concern. You got to rank them in that order, maybe even. But valid point. Councillor Akji, I noticed your hand was raised there earlier.
I'd like to thank Mr. Gopin, because he's been very thorough about what he's been doing, and on our behalf, on the town's behalf, he's worked very hard. So thank you very much. And thanks, Mr. Knopper, because you do all the electronic stuff.
Thank you. Any other councillors?
The meeting on Wednesday, that's a face-to-face meeting, is it not?
That's correct. That'd be I guess you could call it a private meeting. It's not a public meeting.
Right. Thank you.
Anything else? Okay. The only thing I have is it'd be probably a good idea as well, just to, out of respect for some of our service providers, let them know what the name is that we've proposed. I'm talking about Dr. Pierre and the physiotherapist, just because they're major stakeholders as well, and I don't see any disadvantage in being completely open and transparent with everybody that has, you know, some interest in the center. But other than that, that's it. I appreciate everybody's time. Staff, again, Mr. Gopin, thank you very much. We're not going to close session, so I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Councillor Akagi and Councillor Gumashell. We're adjourned.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take care, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Well, I have a question for